Yes, this is Hasegawa Shinji. Thank you very much, Peter. This is Shinji. It was an
Nice to see
excellent
you.
lecture. Nice to see you too. So now we will quickly move on to free discussion if you want, if you're okay.
Yeah.
Thank you. So we have about 30 minutes from now. And Thierry Mayer may not be able to stay until the end, so I will let him speak first. Is it okay for Peter? Thank you. And so far as I can see from the chat, no questions have been received. So I will ask you some questions on behalf. One to Thierry. One is on the proliferation of FTAs. I mean, the world now has nearly 300 FTAs, if I may be right, and is a kind of a race situation to conclude FTAs. And often they are overlapping. Have you included the impact of such situations in your analysis? This is the first question. And the second question is about the changes in the automotive industries. As electric vehicles become more popular and the production of cars will fundamentally change, how will your analysis of the automotive industry be affected by this phenomenon? Could you please try to answer shortly?
Yeah, sure. I'll be short. So on the proliferation of FTAs, indeed, it's becoming quite interesting, actually, to see how things. It's fantastic, by the way, for applied researchers, because it gives us such a rich set of identification for both tariffs and different measures that we actually need this variation over space and time to actually identify things. So that's great. For firms, it also means frequently changing incentives to do the sourcing right. And maybe, as Peter Buckley was saying, to reconsider really global value chains at the reconsidering them as being rational compared to more regional, lower scale value chains that follow the lines of those new borders, in a sense. But one thing that I think also connects to what Peter was saying about the risks associated to that fragmentation of the global economic scene is that one really good aspect of regional agreements is that they tend to be pacifying, in a sense, not pacifying in economic terms, pacifying in general. So military conflicts or political tensions are, despite the highlights of China versus US, most of the conflicts are intrinsically local. And so regional agreements tend to make neighbors more dependent on themselves. And there's a lot of evidence right now that not only through economic ties, but also through providing a forum for discussion, it really lowers quite a lot political tensions and the risk of escalation. So that's, and it might even be an endogenous reaction. right? If the world is getting more globalized because it's easier still within those days to trade long distance, building regional agreements to compensate in a sense and be more dependent locally might be a good response. On your second question, it's so there's two ways to see that the transformation of the car industry. One is that, okay, let's think about what would need to be changed in the way we do things in that particular model and empirics to account for electric vehicles. What really, there's several things. First is that it's going to be essentially a change in two dimensions. The first one is that one part, the battery, is going to have a much larger share than any other parts before. So the battery is about 30 to 35% of the cost of an electric vehicle. Of a battery electric vehicle is going to stay that way for quite a long time, even if progress on batteries is made. And so that means that we have a lot of, let's say, lumpiness. Sorry, lumpiness in the choice is that once you want to comply to rules of origins, for instance, you have to have the battery near the assembly. There's no other choice because that's a third of your cost. And so that really, we can see nowadays, most of the batteries are actually produced in South Korea, China, or Japan originally. But now there's so many plans to build battery plants all over the place to get it closer to the assembly and closer to the final market, because otherwise they won't be able to. That's the first part. The second part is that there's going to be probably changes in the parameters we evaluate. So one of the parameters that really has to do with distance, which is essentially has to do with weight. So it's going to change. It's going to essentially double the average size of cars transported, those in at least in the short run. So that's going to change again quite a lot the optimal choices of those firms. But I don't think it changes the model. It changes more the lumpiness and the parameters of the model rather than fundamentally the model.
Okay, thank you. As far as I can see on the chat, we have a question from Ikegami-san on the aggregation strategy. Is it question is addressed to Thierry or Peter Buckley?
I can see about 3 questions.
Yes,
for me.
yes, please, go ahead.
The first one is about the comparison between US nationalism versus China, and comparing that to US nationalism versus Japan in the 1980s. And I think that's a really interesting point. It's actually a point that I have made myself. And I had a debate with David Teese about this China versus the US, and this came up. And the point that the people who are extremely worried about China make is that this is a threat to the whole system, as it were. China represents an alternative means of doing things that could be potentially exported around the world, and even some people think, might even threaten the US, the US's system. So the argument, I think, is a bit more systemic, but it definitely does have the same element that was there in the 1980s versus when Japan came along. I wrote about that at the time, and I remember that quite well, that the US felt threatened by Japan and therefore started to put barriers and make all kinds of noises about how Japan was going to take over the world economy. I think the issue with China is with the Belt and Road Initiative and with its seemingly much more aggressive political stance, and there's the issues of Taiwan and all the rest of it. This is seen as much more of a threat. But I do take that point. The second question is about aggregation strategy in the short run. Reconsider aggregation strategies. And my argument here is, in the short run, this is exactly, I mean, the questioner there uses the word reconsider. And the point there is that's exactly what firms should do in the short run, a thorough evaluation of their aggregation strategies. Many of them had already, many of the big multinationals and the ones with the global strategies had in fact built this into their strategy before this kind of crisis or fracture occurred, in the so-called China Plus One strategies, where people, big companies had a facility in their global value chain in China, but they had a parallel one in Vietnam as a risk aversion strategy. So reconsider it in the long run, but take the decision in the medium term. But definitely look at the whole issue of value chains. I've been present at some discussions of executives in multinationals about value chains. And I think this is the position that a lot of them take. They are watching this very carefully, evaluating the risk, as Thierry said, and perhaps not moving immediately, but trying to evaluate how they could move were it to become necessary to move. So it's a kind of risk aversion strategy. And the third thing is about, the third question that I've got is about systematic, the bifurcation. And the argument I think here is that what the theoretical position is that moving towards a global economy that is really bifurcated, is really split between a Chinese camp and an American camp. This is an exaggeration, but as a theoretical model, it's quite useful. And within the Chinese camp, very much Belt and Road driven, state-driven, state-owned enterprises dealing state to state. Whereas with the American system, much more use of the market, use of contracts in particular to link the various elements in the chain. So you can build an argument, a theoretical argument, that this is a very severe and very ongoing and very systemic fracture. And it is, I think, something we should think about. I mean, there are points, Thierry made the point about within group agreements between local regions, local people within regions might be positive, and that's true. But moving between the two systems might become extremely difficult, which is why I'm suggesting things like cartels and regional headquarters as means of doing that. But I think the other argument is it may not be two blocks. What about the European bloc in the middle? Are they part of the US or whatever? So there's a big argument to be had here. But I think it's really important that the global environment be looked at not as a single global environment, but as a very much more fragmented and fractured structure that multinationals have to deal with. It makes life extremely interesting. Is that next question for me? The relationship with external shareholders may change, definitely. I mean, this is a really important point, because the point I made at the end about multinationals moving to ESG, environmental, social, and global demands, is parallel by a move from kind of shareholder capitalism to stakeholder capitalism. And I think the role of civil society in that is extremely important. Will this move to codification or personalization? I think probably some of both, depending on what we're talking about. I mean, there are codes that are coming in on climate change and all the rest of it. So it's another set of pressures that multinationals have to think about. And there's a lot of attention being paid to the role of multinationals with regard to the development goals, the strategic development goals of the UN, the SDGs, so sustainable development goals. So all of these are extra pressures on companies and extra dimensions that managers need to take on board. That's another set of pressures. I think the next one's for Thierry.
Yeah, thank you, Peter. I would love to hear from Thierry on your reaction to Peter's point that Peter's have just mentioned about your theoretical argument.
Yeah, just maybe I also have a question that I want.
Yeah, yes.
So on this delta, so here this delta parameter in this model is playing two roles actually. One is shifting the attractiveness of sourcing parts within the region versus outside the region. So that's one like sort of basic comparative advantage story. Indeed, it's influenced by many things, and exchange rate levels might be one of this. But the most important thing about what this delta is doing is indexing firms. Is that different firms, and that's where the model is rich in a sense in the empirics, is that different firms have different existing networks, existing links. Some of them, as Peter was saying, are truly global, some of them more regional, some of them are barely national actually. A lot of firms still have only their own local network. It was a surprise. It was really a surprise to me when I first looked at this data, how much of the car production and assembly actually never crosses a national border. And of course, a lot of this is going from China to China, but not only. It's quite something. So those firms have very different deltas because they have very different networks. Even the big multinationals have very different histories and very different networks, and so that's a key thing. Now, about the influence of exchange rates in our model, the exchange rates. The second part of the question relates to the volatility of those exchange rates. And here it's something we didn't really consider here. It's really a very much a static model in the sense that it's really something where we looked at tariff as one cost shifters. Exchange rates is of course another cost shifter, but it's much more volatile, and we don't really consider it in that thing. Would it change things? Well, yes, in equilibrium, it would change things. But one thing that we know from a long tradition in estimating trade cost elasticities is that the response to exchange rates is 3, 4, or even 5 times less important than the response to tariffs by international trade flows or international investment decision. So it's really something that this volatility has less of an impact than long run tariff. Maybe because firms know, as Peter was saying, firms know that there will be some back and forth, and they try to wait before saying a long term trend in those exchange rates. There's a new question for Peter, I see.
Yes.
Yeah.
How can we reduce transaction? One thing that I'm not sure which fragmented local players you're thinking of here, but one strategy that a couple of strategies that multinationals can and do use in this is to bring together the fragmented local players to try and get them into a cooperative or a system and deal with them as a unit rather than separate. And the other way, of course, this is a role that local headquarters play. Regional headquarters and local headquarters can play a role in aggregating small local players. And it's very interesting that in a lot of multinationals value chains, there are a number of small local players who may have a tiny area of monopoly. They may control it. I know of one firm that is very tiny that has a global monopoly on a tiny unit that goes into a lot of electronic products. And so you have to deal with these very carefully. This is where you need what used to be and still is, I think, called localized strategy. You need to have a global strategy, but you need to be able to deal with local differences. And fragmented local players are one area where the local is very important, and either aggregating them or dealing with them on a case-by-case basis by a local headquarters or a local unit, somebody who understands them, is extremely important. So employing local people in the local headquarters or the local unit to deal with these people is very important, because very often multinationals do not have a choice. We often think they can do whatever they like, but often they have to deal with small players who have a local monopoly, and these can be extremely awkward people to deal with, and they need a lot of careful management. So I think that's quite a good question, an interesting question. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. By the way, the other four speakers of the first half of the day are logged into as panelists, so they can use their own microphones and cameras to speak. So I'd like to invite them to join us. If you have something to say, please feel free to do so.
May I?
Yes, please.
Yes. Hello, Sir Peters and Thierry. I have a question to each. First of all, Peters, I'm Masataka Fujita. When I saw your titles of today's presentations, discontents, I immediately thought of the Joseph Stiglitz publications in the 2000, late 2000 or so. At the time, when you say discontents that come from the consequences of globalization, such as inequality or uneven distribution benefit. Today's what I sensed from you is rather you rather emphasize the environment affecting globalization, such as systemic competitions or splinter net and so on, all of which block the smooth functioning of the value chain. Now, under these situations, for the first type of discontent, it is relatively easy to find a solution, which is education or reskilling or upskilling. But for the second type of the discontent, which comes from systemic factors, what kind of the systems you think which is required to make value chains work? And what is advice to the government, what the policymakers you could offer? Perhaps globalization has slowed down, so everybody agrees, but I don't think it dies out. It simply it changed the phases of globalization. It has become more human being oriented globalization. So human beings come to the fore, so to speak, because we are told that we live in the epoch of Anthropocene, where actually human activities affects the planet rather than the planet affects the human activities. So this is actually kind of questions to the Peter.
Can I answer that, and then I'll forget it if you ask the other one.
Sure.
That's a fantastic question. I mean, the first part of it, there are two things going on, as you point out. One is the people who are discontented because they're left out because of inequality and so on. And I'm not entirely sure that it is that easy to solve that problem. Theoretically, they should be compensated. I mean, this is the Pareto optimality argument. You compensate the losers from the gains of the winners. And in practice, that has not happened. And these people are regionally and industrially concentrated, which gives them the power to be discontented. So I'm not entirely sure that that problem is as easy to get rid of, but I take your point. The second thing is that in the kind of model or the thinking that I have, the environment is kind of exogenous to companies. And companies, in round one at least, companies have to get on with it. They have to adapt. That's the point that I was trying to make. Now, the other point that I mentioned but didn't emphasize enough is what role do businesses play in changing that environment? Not just accepting it and adapting to it, but changing to it. So lobbying, regulatory capture, I mentioned. But where you have a system that's kind of fragmented, you can it's possible. You can only change your part of the system. So American firms, by lobbying, by doing whatever they like, cannot, in this model, affect the Chinese way of doing things. And they have to adapt to that and so on. So however you look at it, I think companies have a role to play. They have a knowledge role, they have a non-market role, they have a PR role, they have a lobbying role. But I think within that, they do have to adapt to circumstances externally. And there's quite a lot more to say about international organizations, but perhaps you and I should have a debate about that elsewhere for time reasons. But very interesting question.
Thank you, Peter. Then the question to Professor Thierry Mayer was, I understand that ROO increase the cost. But I'm wondering, so which cost you are referring to? The cost of the investors or cost of the host country? To me, it seems you are focusing on the cost for the investors. But intuitively, rule of origin itself is not so bad from the host country point of view, because it secures acquisitions of local materials there. So therefore, from the host country point of view, it is good. That's why if you look at all FTA, there is a certain rules of origins in place. RCEP, which is Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement, which is agreed last year and will be implemented beginning of the next year. Rule of origin is 40%, which is below than what is introduced us in the case of NAFTA. Now it's actually US, Canada's Mexico agreement, but the 40% itself actually is I think it's more of a compromised ratio between ASEAN member states and the other 5 partners member states. And the 40% is not necessarily high, but not necessarily low. And I think when you say ROO, rule of origin, when you want to consider the cost, I think it's important to consider both sides, I mean, investor side and host country side. Therefore, in your presentation, which one are you more looking at? Are you taking into account the host country factors? That is my question to you. Thank you.
Thank you. Excellent question. So the answer is pretty simple to that one, is that we're considering the cost to firms. So we're really looking at the fact that you impose the rules of origins on firms necessarily changes what they would have done, at least for part of the firms, without the constraint. Otherwise, it's not a constraint. So there's no content rule. So for some of the firm, there will, at least some of the firm, there will be some constraint that is binding. And our question is very positive, not normative, is very much how will those firms react to that constraint? And at some point, will that constraint be so binding, so strong that it will actually counter fire. That is, it would actually push firms, because firms always have the option to go away, in the sense that they also have the option to pay the tariffs and not be concerned by the 0% tariff. And we wanted to evaluate, of course, this thing from a positive side, from the firm side. Now, on the more normative side, what is a desirable rule of origin? I think it's a much more complicated question, even though, you know, our question is not simple. This is even more complicated because now you need to, there's two things. First, you want to avoid, there's a rule of origin is necessary to some point, because otherwise you want to avoid like pure tax fraud in a sense, or you know, going around. So for instance, I would bring all the cars from China to Canada or Mexico in parts, assemble them out there and sell them in the US at 0 tariff, instead of the tariff that would be normally paid by Chinese imported cars in the US. So you want to avoid that, because that's part of what the concept of the RTA. What is the level needed to avoid that? That's the question you're asking also. Is it 60%? Is it 40%? Different countries have different views, and they evolve over time. It's quite interesting, right? The 40% seems to be quite frequent. And actually for the Brexit, they start at 40% and they will go up to 60. So it's like, it leaves time, as Peter was saying, it takes time for those multinational corporations to turn and to do whatever they have to do. And so I don't know how many years it will take to get to 60%, but it will get to 60% from now, a level of 40%, which is quite interesting. In order to explain in order to judge the normative aspect of that, you need to first weigh in, okay, the pure tax fraud, the cost of the tax sort of evasion, which is clearly a loss, weigh in the cost of less efficient firms, that's going on the other side, and maybe some gains of having local production by car parts, or parts in general. Okay, maybe there are some externalities linked to the fact that you have local provision of critical parts. And we see right nowadays that there might be something. So that's another positive side. So that's a more complicated model, because you need to have externalities and potentially, you know, risk management of the availability of parts. That would be, I think, really interesting to work with such a rich model. And maybe it would be higher than 40% then. Okay.
Okay. Thank you. And the time has come, just on time. So we will end here. Peter and Thierry, thank you so much for taking the time to join us. We very much appreciate you.
Thank you very much. Much appreciate
you
too.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you, and see you next.
Bye.
Merci, à bientôt.
Merci. Au revoir.